In this video, I'm going to introduce a book which is foundational to much of what I talk about in this channel. The book is Credible: Why We Doubt Accusers and Protect Abusers by Deborah Turkheimer. Our society has a problem with rape and sexual assault. Victims of rape and sexual assault are treated differently than victims of any other crime. Let's get into it. Society thinks that this is a really big problem, but in fact, our fear of women lying about being raped is over-exaggerated. This is actually a very small problem. The much bigger problem in our society is that because our belief that women often lie about being raped, we don't hold most offenders accountable, which has led to rape and sexual assault being effectively decriminalized. Deborah Turkheimer, who is the author of Credible, is a professor of law in Chicago. She used to be a sex crimes prosecutor. She uses her expertise and knowledge in this field to give us a detailed examination of how our society puts rape victims at an unfair disadvantage in the legal system, and how this has resulted in this huge problem in our society of offenders not being held accountable. I'll just give you a few key takeaways from the book. She talks about how victims are given a credibility discount, whereas offenders are given a credibility boost. Because rape and sexual assault is a crime that happens mostly in private, where there are usually no witnesses, many times no video footage of the event, and in many cases, even physical evidence, such as DNA, is not helpful when the defense is not that intercourse didn't take place, but that it was consensual. The success of those cases many times comes down to the credibility of the victim's testimony. The difficulty is that victims reporting these crimes don't start out from a neutral place where the fact finder is neither believing nor disbelieving. Instead, their testimonies are given a discount, what the author of this book calls a credibility discount. The fact finder starts from a place of disbelief, which becomes a huge roadblock in these cases getting justice. The author also talks about how our society's fear that people making reports of rape are often lying is an exaggerated one. Studies have shown that false reporting of this crime is possibly around 5%, which is the same estimate as false reports for any other crime. The truth is that false reports of rape are very, very rare, but when they do happen, they are sensationalized, and they feed into that exaggerated fear, seeming to confirm our belief. This exaggerated fear of false reports is followed by an unreasonable demand for evidence. Because we start from a place of believing that the victim is lying, we demand ever more and more evidence before we are willing to believe. In the book, the author talks about the history of disbelieving rape victims in our country. Judges used to tell juries before a rape victim gave her testimony that they should view the testimony with much skepticism because women often lie about being raped. There used to be what was called a prompt outcry rule, meaning that victims had to report the assault immediately or else the report would not be seen as legitimate. As I talked about in my rape myths video, today we know that a delayed report is not a good indication as to whether or not that report is false. Most reports of rape and sexual assault are delayed, and victims have very legitimate reasons for delaying those reports. There used to be a corroboration requirement in the law that said that a rape victim's testimony had to be corroborated before an offender could be convicted. This was different than for victims of any other crime. In other crimes, the victim's testimony did not need to be corroborated. The author of the book talks about what she calls the care gap, which is the tendency that our society has to care more about the negative consequences that the offender would face than we care about the harm that was done to the victim. I'll read a passage from the book. Many of us overestimate by a long shot the likelihood that an accuser is lying or mistaken when she comes forward. Most people start from a position of not wanting to believe that it happened, as described to me by a lawyer with decades of practice handling criminal and civil cases of sexual abuse. You too might adopt an initial stance of disbelief. Over the years, I've heard from well-meaning friends and colleagues with a wildly skewed sense of the frequency of false reporting. We default to doubt. While law enforcement officers are surely not alone in this regard, their attitudes about false rape complaints have been measured more than others. In one survey of nearly 900 police officers, more than half stated that anywhere from 11 to 50% of sexual assault complainants lie about being assaulted, while another 10% of officers surveyed thought the rate of false reporting is somewhere between 51 and 100%. A study of a different set of police officers found that a majority of the detectives believed 40 to 80% of sexual assault complaints are false. In keeping with this distrustful mindset, one Midwestern police officer told researchers, "I don't know what percent it would be, but I would say definitely over a third, probably approaching, 40 or 45%, have very serious questions of the veracity." And in 2016, an Idaho sheriff asserted, "The majority of our rapes that are called in are actually consensual sex." Attitudes like this are reinforced when police officers see their colleagues dismissing similar reports. The confirmation bias leads people to seek out and attend to information that already confirms their beliefs, as psychologist Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford explains. Once we develop theories about how things operate, says Eberhardt, that framework is hard to dislodge. Accusers, regarded as discredited, bolster a sense that accusers shouldn't be believed. This invisible feedback loop is not confined to the police setting. We are all shaped by the reactions of those around us when we judge credibility. We watch to see how accusers we know are treated, how high-profile accusers fare, and what happens when accusers turn to formal systems, the criminal law, campus tribunals, workplace HR. Whenever an allegation is deemed false, the myth of the untrustworthy accuser is reinforced, making it more likely that the next allegation will also be considered false. Disbelief begets disbelief across all walks of life. In the next paragraph, she goes on to talk about how research has shown that false reporting rates are estimated to be between 2 and 8%, and a recent meta-analysis puts the rate at about 5%. What we heard Deborah describing in that passage about the culture of police officers can be described as a cycle of disbelief. Fact finders start out with the belief women often lie about being raped, which then brings them to doubt the victim's testimony, which then leads to not holding the offender accountable, which then leads to 99% of offenders not being held accountable, which then reinforces the myth that women often lie about being raped, and the cycle continues. So read this book. It's a quick read. It's only about 200 pages. About a quarter of the book is citations. It's thoroughly researched. It's quick and punchy. It gets to the point. It doesn't waste your time. Buy lots of copies. Give them to your friends and your loved ones and your local prosecutors. If we are actually going to be successful at reducing sexual violence in our society, then this is where we start, by understanding what the problem is, what the real barriers are to holding offenders accountable.